Happy Wednesday. It's 4 o'clock in New York. It seems that nothing triggers the ex-president like the sometimes icky, frequently uncomfortable, always compelling testimony of the woman whose story Trump tried so very hard to cover up that he ended up getting indicted. Newly released court transcripts show that the ex-president's outbursts earned him a stern rebuke from Judge Juan Maran. Here's how it all went down. Judge Maran saying to Trump's attorney, Todd, Blanch, this, quote, "I understand that your client is upset at this point, but he is cursing audibly, and he is shaking his head visually, and that is contemptuous. It has the potential to intimidate the witness, and the jury can see that." Trump's attorney, Mr. Blanch, quote, "I will talk to him." Judge Michon, speaking for the court. "So I am speaking to you here at the bench because I don't want to embarrass him." Mr. Blanch, "I will talk to him." The judge, speaking for the court. "You need to speak to him. I won't tolerate that." Mr. Blanch, "I will talk to him." Now, one of the moments that inspired that and angered Trump so much was Stormy Daniels' description of part of their encounter in a hotel room in 2006. For reference, here's how she described it on camera for 60 minutes in all its cringeworthy glory. So that happened. Here's how Judge Michon described Trump's reaction when Stormy Daniels recounted that moment in front of the jury yesterday. Quote, "One time I noticed when Ms. Daniels was testifying about rolling up the magazine and presumably smacking your client. And after that point, he shook his head and he looked down. And later, I think he was looking at you, Mr. Blanch. Later, when we were talking about The Apprentice, at that point, he again uttered a vulgarity and looked at you this time. Please talk to him at the break." Stormy Daniels' stunning testimony led to a push by Donald Trump's defense lawyers for a mistrial. And Judge Michon did decide to strike some of the things she said. But Stormy Daniels' testimony on the stand yesterday provides a critical piece of the puzzle in a case that alleges a cover-up of hush money paid to hide her story, a story that went right to one of candidate Trump's biggest political vulnerabilities. A story that includes the sordid details Stormy Daniels described before the jury yesterday. In opposing a motion for mistrial, prosecutor Susan Hoffinger told the judge this, quote, "This story, Your Honor, her account is highly probative of the defendant's intent. His intent and his motive in paying this off and making sure that the American public did not hear this before the election. It is precisely what the defendant did not want to become public." Now, Stormy Daniels is set to return to the stand tomorrow to continue with her cross-examination and most likely a redirect by the prosecutors, setting the stage for another key witness. New York Times reports this. In the weeks ahead, Mr. Cohen is expected to take the stand and connect the dots between the salacious details and the substantive documents. Testimony from the woman paid for her silence, highlighting Trump's potential criminal intent in the Trump election interference hush money trial is where we begin today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Lucky for us, we have a full table. NBC News correspondent Yasmin Vasubian is here. She was inside the courtroom for us yesterday. Joining us at the table, New York Times reporter Kate Christobeck, who's been down there as well, covering the story for the New York Times. And MSNBC national affairs analyst John Heilman is here. You didn't see it, but he made a glorious late Hollywood entrance. It's nice to see you.
I sleep in the basement of the courthouse, so it's hard to get out and get here in time. So it's like, I mean, I'm like a little.
You're excused. Also joining us, former top official of the Department of Justice and MSNBC legal analyst Andrew Weissman. Speaking of sleeping in basements, no one can claim more time served these days than Andrew Weissman.
Although if you've seen his apartment, it's no basement.
I meant when he's here. Let me start with you. I want to sort of put the elephant in the middle of the table. Stormy Daniels' testimony is provoking and I think tapping into all sorts of gender disparities and how she was received, socioeconomic disparities. I think there's a thing. I said this yesterday. I felt bad after reading her testimony about her life story for sort of shorthanding her. I say it like in one breath, porn star Stormy Daniels. She is a human being. She had this interaction with Trump. Everything about it is the kind of stuff that, I mean, you and I talked days ago about being uncomfortable about our parents watching. Yeah. That was, pre-Stormy Daniels. But this is the stuff, and I keep thinking about everything Trump did, from the amount of money he paid to the sound of Trump on tape saying to go and, cash, 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 no, 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 to Pecker's sort of agreement and then line in the sand that I won't be a bank. I mean, I keep thinking of everything she said in the context of how desperate Trump was for us not to know it.
That's why I also think we can't overlook the testimony we heard yesterday morning as well from the publisher using Donald Trump's own words against him, right? Because in that testimony, you see a man, you hear of a man who is a billionaire and who is trying to teach the rest of America how to also be a billionaire, right? How to pinch every penny, down to the paper clip, he says, right? Sign every check, know where every check is going. And then you hear this account from Stormy Daniels, a detailed account that he continues to deny about meeting in 2006, about having sex the night after they met, continued conversations for 8 months after the visit to Trump Tower, how she was then threatened in a parking lot outside of an exercise class with her daughter. And then, of course, the whole scheme that was concocted by Michael Cohen and her attorney at the time and her agent, and connecting those two, and then wondering if the jury, in fact, believes the account of Stormy Daniels. And then if they say to themselves, yes, I believe her, then they think back to the man they heard about early that morning, right? Because every day I feel like is a different trial. And what I mean by that is every day the testimony can stand on its own. They think back to the testimony from the publisher in the morning and they think, well, this is a man who pinches every penny. Why would he pull, right, Michael Cohen? Why would he pay him $420,000 to cover his taxes, to double the payment that he already made because he wanted to cover up something beyond just legal expenses, right? And that is why I keep going back to the paperwork. Right, we've talked continuously as we've kind of led up to this moment where we felt as if the star witness was going to be Stormy Daniels and Michael Cohen, right? But the smoking gun, who is going to be Michael Cohen, right? He's the guy who knows if Donald Trump said to him, we got to pay her because I don't want the voter, the electorate to ever know, right? He's a problematic, we all know, star witness, right? But the paper trail, the papers, right? The documents, the signed checks, the invoices, all of those things are what are ultimately going to tell the story and convince this jury as to whether or not they believe Donald Trump is guilty or not. And that is why yesterday's testimony was so stunning. And I will say, the end of the direct from Hoffinger, in which she brought up that True Social tweet from Donald Trump, in which he said, I never met this woman. We were never together. Who is this crazy person? After all of that detailed testimony, completely contradicting all of what Stormy Daniels had just detailed. And it was this really, I think, at least for the prosecution, a powerful closure before they moved to cross.
Kate, there's always a sort of a debate about whether his lawyers are lawyering or sort of talent managers in their own right. And it was clear yesterday when Judge Michon came out and said, look, I can't do all the objecting for you, that Judge Michon was slightly underwhelmed by their lawyering.
Yes, I certainly think that when he said that, he was putting the impetus on them to say, you need to come out and object to the things that you're having problems with. I think they believe that they had worked some of these details out ahead of time and they didn't need to do so much. But certainly, I think he is really putting that pressure on them to take a stand when they think there's something problematic. And I certainly think that, even Justice Michon himself said, there should have been things that may have been better left unsaid, as this testimony was incredibly vivid. It was incredibly detailed. But again, really putting that pressure on Trump's lawyers to do something. And then, as you said, further keep their client in order and have him not step over the line of the gag order and enter into witness intimidation territory.
He sustained even when there wasn't an objection. There was a point in which he said sustained, and we were like, did someone object to something? And he mentioned that when they brought up the mistrial. He said, I sustained when you weren't even objecting. This is on you to make these objections if you feel as if they're going in a direction in which you don't want to go. These are details that are extraneous and not necessary to testimony.
And Andrew, I think, again, this was testimony that was experienced totally differently if you saw it and heard it. than if you read it on the page. And on the page, it was clear that the act and the story she would tell, if she were free to talk to the media, was exactly what he paid to suppress. So as someone in my line of work, I thought it was interesting to understand what it was he didn't want people to hear between the drop of Access Hollywood and Election Day 2016. It's such a compressed period. His political crisis has been entered into evidence from the C-SPAN tape guy. And I thought that the idea that she was telling the whole story of how she ended up in his hotel room, how the sex went down, the power disparity she felt, the important point she made several times that she didn't feel threatened physically by him ever, was part of what he was paying $130,000 to make sure not a single voter heard between the drop of Access Hollywood and the election. But it seems to have created a lot of churn in sort of legal circles. So explain that to me.
Well, I mean, I think that has it exactly right, which is I keep on analogizing her, and with all due respect to her and your point that she is a human being and a person with a life story, is that for the purposes of this trial, she is largely, not entirely, but largely an exhibit, meaning this is the story. What you are hearing is what would have been made public in October of 2016, but for the hush money payments. And these are the hush money payments that Hope Hicks has already testified. Donald Trump told Hope Hicks, essentially, thank goodness that Michael Cohen paid it. Otherwise, this would have been something we would have to have dealt with before the election, not afterwards. So that the story is actually one where you don't actually need to know whether it is truthful or not, although obviously the jury and us in the public are interested in that. But for the purposes of the trial, it is really just, is this the story that they had an interest in suppressing and creating these false business records to cover up the suppression? And just going back for a second to the Judge Michon intro that you had, where he basically said, tell your client to clam up in front of the jury. I think it's really important to note here that, we're operating in two planes. There's sort of the political plane and there's the trial plane. And it is important to know that if Donald Trump, he obviously is a criminal on the criminal plane, he does not have to testify. He has an absolute right not to. It cannot be used against him. But he has a right to testify. So if he wants to hop on the stand and testify that she is a liar, he has the right to do that. And if you look at this from the political lens, we all of us sitting there going, gee, maybe she's not telling the truth. Well, you know what? He has the ability to testify under oath, subject to cross-examination, that it is not true, in the same way that she has now testified under oath that it is true. And until he were to testify, this is unrebutted in the political sphere. So, this is one where he may want to get his story out by muttering under his breath. But, this is one where, if he really, could put his money where his mouth is, you know what? If you really think this didn't happen, you have a right to testify and be subject to cross-examination on that issue.
We know he's on tape talking about exactly how the money would be moved to her, and just moving into what the jury heard and what they thought of it. Again, I'm not a lawyer. You're not a lawyer, so this is a perfect part of the conversation for you and I to have together. I think the point is, if you were uncomfortable listening to her story, if it made you like her and him a little bit less, that was why he paid $130,000 to make sure that you and the entire American electorate never heard that story. From the swatting to the condom to the STD, all of it, whatever you felt most appalled by, that was worth $130,000 to him to silence.
Yeah, and I agree with Andrew. It's that there is a legal realm and there's a political realm. I don't really think that anybody believes him does anybody believe him that he didn't do this? I mean, nobody believes that, right? I mean, I'm sure there's somebody, but like, I mean, sure. Everybody, I mean, there's somebody who believes everything in America, and there are people who are so devoted to Donald Trump, don't believe anything he says. But like, his
brain, Jim Jordan believes Trump.
In that period you just talked about in October, which I remember vividly of 2016, there was this parade of women who came forward and accused him of sexual assault and sexual misconduct in that period, and they denied all of them. All of them. Every single one. Didn't matter. I mean, there were some of those women had very detailed accounts. Some of them had less detailed accounts. Some of them were more credible. Some of them were less credible. But their stance, their posture out of Access Hollywood is we're going to deny every single one of them. We're going to attack every single woman who says all this stuff. I'm just going to say I didn't do any of this. And honestly, like at the time and now, I'm not sure that many people then believed him. Even the people who voted for him. I think a lot of people looked at Donald Trump and thought, yeah, of course. Donald Trump's catted around, and now these women are mad and they're, whatever. But they didn't believe, I don't think the fundamental question was whether he did this thing or not. And I think in Stormy Daniels' case, the idea that they met, they took this picture and never saw each other again, given everything else we know, everything else been entered into evidence, journalistic evidence now in the courtroom, I think the questions revolve around the thing you're getting at, Nicole, which is, for a jury and for political, this is where the two things kind of come together, why did he do this? Not why did he do the thing he did with Stormy Daniels, but why did he decide to silence her? Why did he do that? And what was the effect of that? And if that was an act of election subversion, that's one thing. If that was a guy who didn't want the world to know, his wife to know, anyone to know that he had an affair with a adult film actress, that's another thing. And there's a whole other political thing of how much of this is all just priced into the stock on Donald Trump. But I don't think yes, not then. Sure. I mean, and I don't deny at all that this account, had it come out in the fall in its full tawdry glory, could have had some effect on the electorate.
You think it would have changed things?
I don't know. I mean, because like I said, I think a lot of people were in the way that a lot of people, Joe's talking about it on Morning Joe this morning, people after Monica Lewinsky, Bill Clinton's approval ratings went up. And I think a lot of people thought that Bill Clinton was a dog in a lot of ways. And people, it was a different time related to interns and sexual harassment. People have different sensitivities now than they did then. But there's still a little Bill Clinton, lovable rogue, he's a scoundrel. There's a little bit of that always has been true with Trump. So I don't know. It was a very close election. A few votes here or there could have made the difference. But I do think the thing when we get to the end here for the jury is not going to be litigating this. That's why I think in the end, there are lawyers, and Andrew and I were talking about earlier today, there are lawyers who think this was a mistake for the prosecution to put this her on because they didn't need to prove this. I think in the jury's mind, thinking about like why, what was the motivation for doing the things that are in the record? This does illuminate the motivation because there is that thing you just pointed to, which is, wow, Trump was thinking what this would all sound like in a moment when they were beating back most of these accusations. And a detailed account like this, when they were successfully politically beating back most of the accusations from these women, might have been problematic. They were certainly terrified of it on the Trump campaign across the board, that a detailed account from one of these women that was credible would be the thing that would sink in.
All right, we have so much more to get to. We barely scratched the surface. No one goes anywhere. Also to come for us, the Trump-appointed judge in the Mar-a-Lago documents case has given the criminally indicted ex-president a really, really big and long lifeline. What that means for that criminal case that's so rock solid. Even Bill Barr said his goose was cooked. Plus, it's still important to have faith in the rule of law. We are told while this current Trump trial is going on, Trump's autocratic ways and that of his enablers are on full display, being propped up by those allies on the right in prominent ways. We'll show you. And later in the broadcast, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a third-party candidate for president, saying he has both short and long-term memory difficulties, in his own words, because of a worm. We'll bring you all the sorted. Talk about sorted. You know what we got today, Halman? We've got Stormy, we've got brainworms, and we've got dead dogs.
It gives a whole new meaning. People talk about tequila. They say eat the worm. They really gives a whole new meaning to that.
Yeah, I don't think you're supposed to.
I bet Halman.
It's a high school thing.
We will have the reporter who broke that story about the dead worms in the brain, not the dogs, joining us later in the broadcast. Don't go anywhere. We're all back. Yasmin, Kate, John, and Andrew. I mean, Yasmin, it seems like if the prosecution can make this turn and say whatever you experienced while listening to Stormy Daniels on direct or on cross-examination, which is expected to be just as brutal as it was when it started yesterday, when it picks up tomorrow, and I'm sure is in part client-directed. However awful you feel, the more awful you feel listening to it, That's what he didn't want the voters to feel. And they've already entered into evidence Trump at a podium saying, you know, I lose 5%, I lose Wisconsin. I mean, it's not about what anybody thinks of Stormy Daniels. She's in his room because he brings her there. She has sex with him because he wants to. But whatever you think of that story, that's the story that he broke laws to hide.
Well, and that's why they walked through the timeline with all of the other witnesses leading up to Stormy Daniels' testimony as well, right? We heard about the release of the Access Hollywood tape. Hope Hicks kind of painting this man who was desperate to win an election in November, and Access Hollywood comes out and they're desperate to make sure that they deny, as she said in her testimony, right? October 26th, the reach out, Keith Davidson, Michael Cohen, talking about both Karen McDougal and Stormy Daniels. I mean, everything was kind of coming to fruition in the final weeks leading up to November. He yet didn't have the confidence to know that he could actually win this election. He thought back to this alleged involvement with Stormy Daniels. If this comes out, if she recounts the story that she told on the stand yesterday, right, coming from this adult film actress, her storied past, right, her checkered past, her checkered history, and then you think about the electorate that was coming out to pull the lever for him to vote in his favor. And so then it speaks to what Heilman was talking about in the last segment, which was that motivation. And that is what I think, and that is one of the reasons why I think the main reasons why the prosecution put her on the stand, to really kind of show the jury the motivation. And I have to say, watching that jury, I mean, if I can just paint a quick picture for you of that courtroom, Stormy Daniels is a mere 2 feet away from the jury box. And there's about 2 feet of wood between her, and then she has to peek around that corner to see Donald Trump. So at one point they said, "Can you identify the defendant in the room, Donald J. Trump?" And she said, "Yeah, I think he's here." And she kind of, in a cute way, you know, peers around the wood and then points at Donald Trump in, like, it seemed somewhat awkward, nervous way. But the jury was intently listening to her. All of their bodies turned towards her throughout that entire explanation of that night back in 2006 and their sexual encounter. And it wasn't until Judge Juan Maran started to chide her, right, for reasons of speaking out of turn or not necessarily answering the question correctly or kind of adding all these extra details, that the jury said to themselves, it seemed to me as if the energy that I was getting from them, that they seemed to be less interested until cross-examination. But the motivation, I think, from the prosecution is what was really the thing they wanted to put forward with her testimony. And
the lack of interest and discomfort are hard to decipher, right?
Yeah.
Agree. And I think there's something uncomfortable. I mean, look at the way Hope Hicks was covered when she was speaking too quietly. Judge Michon had to tell her to speak up. She cried, and there was a flood of sympathy for an ex-model like Hope Hicks. Stormy Daniels, who described herself as at 17, her mother, quote, disappeared. She was a good student of veterinary medicine by her own telling. She worked for her student newspaper. Hers was a story of someone in a very different socioeconomic bracket who turned to nude modeling and ultimately adult films to make money. And she did it because she danced, she said, on the weekends because she could stay in school.
Yeah.
The reaction, whether it was disinterest or discomfort, to someone of a totally different socioeconomic bracket is interesting. And I don't expect you to have an answer. I won't put you on the spot and ask you for one. But again, Stormy Daniels is on the stand because Donald Trump summoned her to his hotel room. His bodyguard, Keith Trump, in her phone, stood outside the door while he stripped down his boxers, in her telling twice, once to be spanked by her and the second time to have sex with her. And I guess what I'm wondering is, what is your sense of whether the prosecution was deterred by what Yasmin describes as disinterest or discomfort by her testimony?
That's such an interesting question, and it's so hard to know with the prosecution. And it's certainly, and I think goes to your point, like, this was a calculated choice on their part to want to put her as a witness. As many former prosecutors have said, maybe that wasn't necessary, but they thought that by putting her as a witness, they likely thought that there was a value to be gained. And, you know, whether that was a good calculus or not is something that's yet to be seen. But I think, to your point, you know, she really got on the stand. She talked at length and gave vivid detail about her background. And even if she eventually got pulled in and reined in by the judge a few times, then the defense team had a difficult opportunity at that point to cross-examine her and really, in a sense, go after her for things that I think there was kind of a thought from reporters in the courtroom that at that point, she rehabilitated herself in some ways. So,
yeah, what was this? You said you bought a ranch. She's like, I rented a ranch. I said I paid for it. I mean, what were they trying to prosecute her on? Being rich or being poor?
I think they, in their cross-examination, which we will see more of tomorrow, they tried to get at things which normally a defense attorney would get at in a court of law, like you haven't paid a court judgment. In this case, the defamation money that's owed to Trump as part of an extra lawsuit out there. And I think they were trying to get at, you have this money, you have the ability to pay, but it was in such a roundabout way. And then after the testimony that she had already given about her humble upbringings, and I think that at this point, I think was seen by some as potentially allowing her to rehabilitate some of whatever goodwill might have been lost.
Which, by the way, and I think Andrew can speak to probably this, which I thought was kind of risky for the defense in their cross, in going after her in a way that they can also speak to their own client about, right? Going after her social media posts, right? Going after the fact that she's not necessarily paying off some of these judgments. Lying, right? These are all things that Donald Trump has also been accused of, right? That the prosecution that can then turn on Donald Trump if, in fact, he decides to take the stand, and or if they decide to do it in redirect. So I don't know. It seemed risky to me at times that they were kind of accusing. I mean, remember that one exchange where they brought up one of Stormy's tweets and they said, and she called Donald Trump a name, orange, whatever. And she said, well, he did it first. It was this back and forth as if we were back in high school and they were kind of going at each other, but acting somewhat similarly.
Yeah, I mean, Andrew, just weigh in. I feel like the best case that's been prosecuted against Donald Trump in public view was the January 6th Select Committee. And what they did was they wallpapered witness after witness after witness after witness after witness after witness who voted for Trump, liked Trump, and told the same story about Trump. Did he know he lost? Yes. Did he know he lost? How did he know? I told him. Did he know that the fraud claims were, BS? Bill Barr, yes, I told him they were BS. I mean, person after person after person, they all love Trump and they all told the same story. You have a version of that here where Pecker comes in and says, was he worried about Melania? No, he never mentioned Melania. And then you have Keith Davidson, did he want to pay to keep Stormy Daniels quiet? No, it reached a crescendo after Access. I mean, they're all telling a different, sort of shake of the kaleidoscope of the same exact story. Access Hollywood drops. He's desperate to not prove whether or not he's Teflon Don yet. He's desperate for this story not to get out, as uncomfortable and sort of lewd as some of its details are. And so he sends Michael Cohen in there to shut him up when Pecker says he won't pay. No one has told a different version of that story. So just explain to me, if it's not sort of personal, what is the strategy for coming after Stormy Daniels as viciously as the defense did yesterday?
Well, first, I agree with you that the case really is that it's different witnesses from different vantage points. And to Yasmin's point, some of those, quote, witnesses are the documents, which are devastating. I mean, Exhibits 35 and 36, the handwritten notes from Alan Weisselberg and Jeff McConney are devastating, where they detail exactly what we're going to hear from Michael Cohen, which, of course, he didn't know that they were writing those notes at the time. So it's just incredible corroboration of the cover-up part of the scheme, which is really the key charge in the case. So there is this sort of multiple layering. And, what is that consistent with? Is it consistent with the story that we have laid out as to what happened here and that Michael Cohen has told you? Or is it consistent with the defense, which is none of this happened, but there's no witness and there's no evidence of that, and all of the evidence is going to point in the other way? So, just to be fair to the defense here, a lot of times, you have a hand that's dealt and you just try and, poke holes and distract because there isn't a consistent theory because the facts point to guilt. But you have an obligation to the system and your client to hold the prosecution to its burden. And I just want to pick up on something you've been discussing, particularly, John, on this issue of, is it a mistake in terms of how Stormy Daniels was presented? And I've been thinking about this a lot, whether, the prosecution should have been a little bit more arm's length and presented as, this is her story, but, you don't really need to believe it. And I was just thinking that maybe strategically was perhaps if you were in a civil case, you might think strategically that was the way to play it. But I was thinking about the different role that a prosecutor has here, which is to present, if you believe the witness, to present her story to the jury.
Yeah. And that, I mean, I think it's so triggering for Trump, and it triggers anyone. Everyone that watched it had a different experience of it, and people that saw it and heard it reacted differently than people that simply read it, which I simply read it. Thank you all so much. Thank you for being here at the table, Yasmin and Kate. So nice to see both of you. You'll be back in court tomorrow?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
We'll continue. It's nice to have you here, but we're glad that you're there.
Be out there.
Our eyes and ears. Our eyes and ears.
So enthusiastic.
Yasmin, like on day 2, I think it was like one of the lawyers. Like, I hope my parents are watching, and that was pre-stormy. So
by the way, they were watching.
Oh no. Okay. I hope not today. All right, coming up, Donald Trump's legal strategy in all of his criminal cases, he has so many, has been delay. Well, now the Trump-appointed judge overseeing the classified documents case has bought that strategy.